Okay, welcome everyone. We're so glad that you're here for a special 49er industry chat celebrating Constitution Day. I am Mateo Maya, Chief Government Relations Officer for ASI here at Cal State Long Beach. Before we start the session and introduce our speaker, I would just want to let you know this session is being recorded and will be available on demand on our website at csulb.edu/alumni. Also, if you have any questions for a speaker, please submit them through the Q&A box right below the screen. That will allow us to keep track of what gets answered. Before I introduce the moderator, I just want to emphasize the importance of this type of conversations. With elections around the corner, it is crucial that we're pushing civic engagement, mostly among students and youth. So please make sure that you're registered to vote. And now I would like to introduce you James Amata, 2011 alumni, Senior Communication Manager for ASI and former student of Dr. Kevin Johnson.
Thanks, Mateo. I appreciate it. Yeah, so I'm going to be here moderating today. I'm a part of our alumni council for CSULB. It's been a lot of fun. I'm actually a poli-sci graduate, undergrad, and it's been a lot of fun over the summer and now in early fall semester to kind of meet folks affiliated with CSULB and all the great information and industry really insight we're getting to learn. We've talked to folks from the MBA or from other different disciplines, and today's is actually a really special day for me because I get to speak to one of my former professors, and I've been telling people one of my favorite professors from back in the day. So very exciting. I currently, as Mateo mentioned, work for ASI, and I get to work with students every day on messaging, on kind of refining what type of impact they want to have on campus, especially in their leadership roles, Mateo included. So thank you, Mateo. But really, this is a really good pleasure for me to get to know folks and to get to hear about CSULB's history and impact in the community. So let's go ahead. And before I introduce our speaker, I just want to let you know it's not going to be a presentation style today. We are going to be having a conversation. This is really your conversation. So as Mateo mentioned, make sure to insert those questions in the chat box so we can track those and get them answered for you because it's going to be a fun dialogue. Okay, so let's see, that's the dialogue box. There's two ways to do that. There's a Q&A, which is what we prefer, but there is a chat box too, so if you use that, don't worry about it. It's okay, we'll figure it out. All right, and let me introduce Dr. Kevin Johnson, Director of the Center for First Amendment Studies and Professor of Communication Studies at CSULB. Dr. Johnson has been involved with the Center since 2000, when he was a graduate research fellow for the Center. After serving 7 years as the Director of Research, he became the Director of the Center. He is the author of over 30 scholarly essays and books and book chapters. His most recent work includes essays in the First Amendment Studies Journal, Communication Law Review, Rhetoric Society Quarterly, and Review of Communication. In addition, he has presented over 70 competitively accepted conference papers and presentations and appeared on top papers panels for the National Communication Associations, the NCA, Freedom of Expression Division, Rhetoric and Public Address Division, and Environmental Communication Division. He has received the Robert O'Neill Top Paper Award from the Freedom of Expression Division of NCA, and the David, I'm going to get this wrong, Eichelman Paper Award from the Law and Policy Division of the Broadcast Education Association. He has delivered invited lectures in the United States and Europe on rhetoric and First Amendment issues, and has been a guest to attend oral arguments at the Supreme Court of the United States. He has served as a consultant for argument strategy for counsel arguing in federal court, and has been recognized for his civic service by members of the U.S. House of Representatives, the California State Senate and Assembly, Los Angeles County, and the City of Long Beach. He is currently also Vice Chair of the Freedom of Expression Division of the National Communication Association and Vice Chair of the Law and Policy Division of the Broadcast Education Association. We are so excited to have him here today. Welcome, Dr. Johnson. Normally, Dr. Johnson, this is where we would applaud you and then bring you in to the room. That's kind of how that would normally work, but okay.
Yeah, it's fine.
So I guess, so welcome. I want to start
so
kind of, say that again?
Thank you for having me here today.
Of course. Dr. Johnson, before kind of going into it and having our dialogue, I did want you to kind of help start us off by giving us an overview of what rhetoric is, what First Amendment rhetoric and the First Amendment and how those are related and what we're kind of going to be discussing today.
Yeah, thank you for having me here today. It's great to be here with all the fellow Long Beach State alums. We are a proud family of Long Beach State 49ers and Sharks. That's another conversation for another day. And in my family, I think we have about 14 degrees earned from the institution. So we believe in very much what we have to offer at our university. So thank you for having me here today. My study of the First Amendment is grounded in a rhetorical approach. And I don't want to get all crazy fancy about it, but roughly speaking, Aristotle was one of the first ones to define rhetoric as the faculty of discerning in any given situation the available means of persuasion. And one of the ways that persuasion occurs is, according to another theorist, the adjusting of people to ideas and ideas to people. Well, the Constitution is one of those ideas. It's one of those documents that needs to undergo particular strategies of persuasion, different modes of interpreting this document. Not everybody agrees on the meaning of these documents, not even the Supreme Court justices in many of the cases. Even though the most common decision for the Supreme Court to reach is a unanimous one, oftentimes you find the justices disagreeing even when their ideologies may align. You can find cases such as the ones involving violent video games, where Justice Thomas and Justice Scalia, known to be ideological on the same page, differ with one another. So then, from a communication perspective, we take a look at how is it that we can make sense of these differences? How can we strategize within those range of differences to make arguments in a legal setting? And what kind of resources are available in terms of interpreting these particular legal documents? And so that's generally kind of my approach to the study of the First Amendment. It's grounded in this kind of rhetorical perspective.
So I guess the first question I have to ask you is, how did you find yourself finding this discipline as the way to go? Did you know this in undergrad, or was this something you kind of found along the way? We always like to talk a little bit about the journey of our speakers a little bit. And I'm just very curious as to how you found this niche, I guess.
Well, I kind of stumbled upon it a little bit. I was a high school speech and debater, and then I spent a year at Orange Coast Community College doing speech and debate. And so then when I transferred, the speech and debate team was a natural fit for me, so I did speech and debate for Long Beach State. And then when I got here and declared a major, a lot of the people who were in speech and debate and the director had speech training. One of my professors that I had been introduced to before I had taken a class was Dr. Craig Smith, and he had been involved in speech writing for Presidents Ford and Bush Sr., and has been involved in that kind of political speech writing. And I've always been interested in politics. It's not that speech communication was my initial, or was my set in stone idea. There was a point where I was like, should I be doing political science, or should I be doing philosophy, or should I be doing communication studies? So that was a conversation that I had, but I found that communication studies offered me the possibility to study the range of ideas and theories and practically applied kind of situations that I wanted to study. That I felt like if I was in another department like political science, for example, I might not be able to study the role of rhetoric in sports, or the role of communication in the environmental speech making, or the role of persuasion per se. And some political science have a slightly different emphasis. So I was drawn to it pretty much because I was interested in it.
Yeah, and when it comes to political, and we'll get to current, the current climate of conversation, but kind of looking back at, you just mentioned Dr. Craig Smith and the speeches he worked on and his time as a speechwriter, and even moving forward, maybe more recently into the 80s and 90s of different leadership. Are there any trends that you think that you started seeing then that you have seen amplified now, or just kind of what are your thoughts when you were reflecting on your career path and what you were studying then and how that maybe is beginning to look?
I mean, I've always been interested in communication in terms of its practical consequences, right? How is it that we communicate in a public setting to be able to maybe share. That's part of the communal nature of communication. How do we share in our meaning-making symbols? How is it that, you know, different people from different ideological perspectives can have a share in our democratic project, right? Because democracy at its very core is about sharing power and making this work together in some way. Even though we're divided in many capacities, we occupy that same kind of space and umbrella in which our governance takes place. So how is it that communication can facilitate that in the way that we create meaning together, right? And how do we forge these kinds of communities and partnerships and working together in productive ways? And so I thought that that's what, you know, communication studies really did for me in being able to understand and study democratic speech, Republican speech, independent speech, marginalized community speech, et cetera. The intersections of all of those kinds of politics, I think, are really important if we're going to have any hope. And the most generous reading is continuing our democracy, and the more pessimistic reading is saving our democracy, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you know, we did receive several questions even before today's conversation, and one of them was really about today's media climate when it comes to how that affects the communication of even the politics that we have. And they laid out some really specific examples. But before I get to some of those examples, are there some thoughts that you? I mean, I know you worked on many analyses and papers on topics similar to this. Yeah, just kind of generally interested in your thoughts before we dive into some of those questions.
Yeah, so one of the interesting things that I have about the First Amendment is that I found that there's a direct linkage between the skills that one would get in studying the Constitution from this rhetorical perspective and the kind of portable skills that you would have outside, right? So, for example, when one is taking a look at how to interpret the Constitution, people argue in a similar kind of manner over the Constitution as they do within organizational bylaws. We've all been part of organizations that have argued about bylaws. What does this little provision of the bylaws mean? And does it mean this? And when it says 7, doesn't mean that I couldn't expand it to 9, or does it mean only 7, right? And, you know, so like all of these different kind of debates we have about the statutory interpretations are the same kind of guiding things that we have about the Constitution. So, for example, if we are debating about mandatory types of equipment that one must have, right, in a sporting event, and the bylaws say you need to have a catcher's mask, right? And we're arguing over the rules, and the umpires get together and they decide that the mask that this person's wearing is not up to the safety codes, right? Now, we have to interpret that event in light of the principles that we have to work with, right? So one could take a look and say, historically, the requirement to wear a mask, the intent of the framers of that was to keep the players safe, right? And so they can interpret it in saying that, yeah, they weren't safe really at the time, because their catcher's masks were antiquated, but now we have safer catcher's masks. So to abide by that value that the framers had, they do have to use this catcher's mask as the interpretation over this catcher's mask, right? They could look at the text, and the textual interpretation would be, look at the words themselves. So what if they're wearing a pair of glasses with a COVID mask on, right? It says mask, it doesn't say what kind of mask, right? The bylaws say mask, that's all that's required. It doesn't say a type of catcher's mask, it just says mask. So just look at the text. The framers' original intent doesn't matter, right? Or that, you know, we're talking about precedent, right? So one can make an argument and say, that catcher's mask is fine because that's the one that we've always used, right? We have a precedent for this established from prior games that, you know, we applied to this particular case. I think we make these kind of arguments in all of the organizations that we're part of when it comes to bylaws. So the study of the First Amendment is not just the study of the First Amendment, it's about how we argue about the statutes that govern our organizations.
Well, I love how you simplified that for like comparing it to just a very because I felt like I was a little bit in a back in class when we were talking about the different justices arguing for different reasons and having their historical context or different context around why they were arguing a certain way. But comparing it to a baseball team or a baseball league who's looking at their bylaws is a much more easy way to understand the different debate that could happen there. And you know, today's court is quite different than it was when I was your student over probably a decade ago or so. So you know, what is the makeup now when it comes to how they're interpreting? Is there a balance, or is it kind of all over the place, or what does that look like?
Well, I don't know that we have enough body of decisions to really determine that when it comes to the most recent justices with Gorsuch and Kavanaugh. But I do think that it's very interesting that so far Gorsuch hasn't necessarily voted 100% the way that people would predict him to judge. One of the notable things that I found interesting is that when you were a student, I believe that Justice Stevens was still on the court. And Justice Stevens and maybe even Justice Souter, I think that they were both on the court maybe when you were a student. I'm not sure about that. But the interesting thing about Justice Stevens and Justice Souter is that they were both appointed by Republican justices or Republican presidents, right? So you had Justice Souter, who was appointed or nominated by George H.W. Bush, and you have Justice Stevens, who was a President Ford appointee, right? Yet those two justices were on the for side of a controversial decision like Bush v. Gore in the 5-4, right? So you have Republican justices that have maybe flipped over time to rule more liberally as maybe they get older or they have more time on the court, or maybe the court gets more conservative and they insist that they're not changing at all, that the nature of the party has shifted, and that they've actually been maybe by today's standards a liberal Republican. There's a lot of different dynamics to account for that, but I think that it's interesting to note that justices don't always rule along their ideologically predictable lines. That's why, for me, it's more important when you're trying to argue in front of the court or something like that to look at the actual writings they have, figure out the kinds of rationales they give. Do they care more about the history, for example, and the historical framers' interpretation, or do they care more about the words of the Constitution, or do they more care about the principles that were embedded in it, or do they care about the prudential interpretation of what's prudent for government or administration? If you can look at those rationales and those reasons, then you can kind of argue from within those kinds of paradigms. So you can still have an argument about, you know, would the framers have allowed Citizens United to have constitutionally protected speech? Because there's an argument that says that at the time of the founders, corporations were granted charter by the legislators, and the corporations answered to the Congress people. They didn't have a say in who could be elected. They spoke on matters of public concern, but they never spoke about direct advocacy or defeat of a political candidate. So there's an argument that the founders would not have supported the ruling in Citizens United, right? So to me, it's more interesting about the kinds of rationales that they used and not necessarily about the ideology, if you will.
Yeah. And I will say that you're a true student of all those rationales, right? And so sometimes we have folks who maybe you're just getting the snippets of the media, what people kind of see, kind of boiled down to what you get from it. And I do wonder what you think about how that communication could be better in a more public setting, consumable way that folks can kind of, you know, get. And I'm curious as to know.
I hesitate to make plugs to support our center and donating to our center too much, but I will. But I mean, one of the things we do
it's
is
Constitution Day, Dr. Johnson.
Yeah.
It's really okay to do that.
Try to educate students and people about Supreme Court literacy. You know, not only learning the Supreme Court justices, because 2/3 of the American public can't even name a single Supreme Court justice, and that's like even after the Kavanaugh hearings and so forth, right? They can't even name a single Supreme Court justice, 2/3 of the public. And so, you know, we try to encourage people, and in my First Amendment courses, we read the exact cases from the court. And so we can get a literacy about how to access these kinds of documents so that maybe we're not relying too much on the mediated form.
Yeah.
We can read the decision itself. And I think a really good example of that is the Masterpiece Cakes decision. A lot of people think about that case as being about legalizing discrimination and allowing a cake shop to not sell cakes to a same-sex couple for their wedding. But really, if you read the decision, it's about the hostility toward a religion argument. It's about how the Colorado Civil Rights Commission heard that trial. So they were actually, the whole decision is about how the Colorado Civil Rights Commission expressed hostility toward a religion. They left open the question of whether or not the cake shop maker could be held in violation of the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. So the Supreme Court actually gave the mechanism for a Civil Rights Commission, like in Colorado, to potentially enforce their anti-discrimination policies, and gave a guidance to them as to how to avoid kind of hostility toward religion and rendering that kind of decision. So, but if you read the newspapers, it's all about, you know, cake shop makers can discriminate against same-sex couples, which, you know, the Supreme Court didn't say.
Well, that's kind of to the point of a question that was exactly being answered, is that sometimes those snippets are just, they maybe direct the public in a different direction for that comment, because that would have been great. And I honestly followed it a little bit and did not follow it as in depth as clearly I should have on some of those pieces. And I wonder, is there not a mechanism that the media are having about having that in a different, because I get it at the education level, and for sure in our college settings.
Yeah, so it's a tough thing, you know. It used to be, you know, this is part of the economic pressures that a lot of newsrooms face. They've gutted a lot of their specialists because, you know, the subscriptions to newspapers has declined. The amount of money and resources that these newspapers had at one time is much smaller. And it used to be that, you know, a newspaper might have a Supreme Court correspondent on staff, you know, so they knew how to read a decision, and they would interview that person, and they would have that specialist in that particular newsroom, and each newsroom would have that specialist. And now that specialist has been cut because of costs, and maybe they're hiring somebody who's brand new out of the School of Journalism, which is fantastic opportunity for our students, for example. And at the same time, we lose a lot of that institutional memory from the kind of senior staff writer perspective about how to cover the Supreme Court. So when you lose that kind of correspondent, you also lose the ability to reliably think that a news reporter has the tools equipped to read a Supreme Court decision and communicate accurately that decision to the public, you know? So I think it's in large part a consequence of not having these kinds of specialists on staff anymore. And that's related to the economic kind of decisions that result from staff layoffs and not having the number of readerships and things like that that traditional newspapers would have.
So one of the questions actually relates to that too, which was, do you believe that does it relate? Is the First Amendment being applied equally to the right and the left, is how the question was phrased. But I think what I'm kind of hearing from you is that it's not about necessarily a right and a left application. There's a really big media issue there with the way that they're focusing on really the kind of bottom line, because they're mostly cable news now that covers that sort of stuff. And maybe it's not a right or left application of how they're, because we can't govern what they report either, because that's also covered under the first. So it's not, anyways, I'm just kind of going off of this question. Yeah.
So an important thing to consider when we talk about the First Amendment is that there's kind of two guiding principles that I think can help in some cases kind of distinguish between kind of the First Amendment as it exists and the First Amendment as a cultural value, if you will, right? So like, as it exists, if you take a case like Colin Kaepernick kneeling during the national anthem, as it exists, the government wasn't involved in that, right? So if the NFL wants to fine the player for doing that or whatever, they're a private organization, right? Private organizations are not subject to the First Amendment in that way. The First Amendment says Congress shall make no law, right? It doesn't say that a private company can't restrict an employee's speech, right? And so if the First Amendment is about the government intrusion, there's a lot of speech today that people think about as public and applicable to the First Amendment when it's actually private to private to private to private to private speech. And the government's not involved at all, right? Mm-hmm. And on the other hand, we have this question of what are the values that we value in the First Amendment, right? That's a different kind of question than kind of this legal question. The values are, you know, the people who are saying that, for example, Kaepernick should have the right to kneel in the stadium, they're going to argue that there's a value that we have as Americans to free speech. And if a corporation like the NFL says that they can't speak, that violates what we think we are as Americans and allowing Americans to express themselves in a political manner, right? That we should be more tolerant to that kind of political speech as a value-oriented thing as Americans, right? And so that divide, I think, is so important between the notion of what First Amendment rights are and what we think First Amendment values should be, right? Those are the two kind of fundamental things that I think get murkied and clouded when we're talking about the First Amendment in this kind of public sphere, if you will.
Yeah, and then these media entities are mostly private entities. And so I do wonder, you mentioned that in the past there used to be, you would maybe hire communication or rhetoric professional or someone who is professional in understanding the legal proceedings of the Supreme Court. And they're not doing that as much, or if they are, like you mentioned, there may be a different level of education they may have. When did that change when it came to the media's value of putting that on that type of role or on that type of position? Is there a gauge on that, or is that kind of just, again, bottom line only, or was there a time that kind of—
Well, it's a large progression to the decentralization of media outlets, right? I mean, we can go back all the way to the history of the regulation of public broadcasting with the Communications Act of 1924. For some reason, I'm thinking 26, but I think it's 24. But the Communications Act in the early 20th century, anyway, that regulation was put in place because of the scarcity principle, where there were only so many networks that could be granted because there was only so much bandwidth, right? If you were, you couldn't have lots of television channels because there just wasn't the bandwidth space to have it. So the government began regulating who got access to those airwaves. With the invention of cable television, and then with the invention of the internet, it got rid of that scarcity principle. And as the media entities started to proliferate, it decreased the amount of revenues that could be garnered by any one media entity. So ABC News and CBS News and NBC News, that were like the predominant kind of news authorities, they lost a lot of their institutional money and support and power and influence and all of that. And with that, decentralization led to less resources for any of these institutions to have. And therefore they had to start, laying off staff in terms of specialists, and maybe leaving that specialist to a network like C-SPAN or to a classroom at a university and trying to book interviews to appear on 50 different networks, which is impossible for any one expert to kind of do. So there's a tension there between too much centralization and decentralization, but that's kind of how I think that it happened in order to answer your question.
No, that's great. And I think that gives us a historical context, because sometimes I think we talk about it as it's happening now, like, the last 10 or 20 years. And I think what you just did is kind of put it in this context of 100 years, basically, and talking about how that evolved. We did get a question in the chat as well. And I just want to take this quick moment before moving to that question to talk to our viewers. If you do have a question, feel free to just, again, any point in time that Dr. Johnson's talking, just feel free to throw it in there. We'll get to it maybe a little later, but just go ahead and put it in there and we'll move back to it. So one question we did just get from one of our viewers is about political correctness and the political correctness kind of environment that we're in. And do you believe that that has an impact on, and really, is it trying to stop freedom of speech, or how you kind of view that through your lens, given your background? And then particularly the higher schools of education. So I think also in a university environment, and how is that political correctness maybe seen in the higher education?
Yeah, so political correctness is an interesting term for me, because I think what's lost in that kind of political correctness is the genuine kind of commitment and the expectation of mutuality with other people, right? So, you know, the language becomes a very difficult thing to kind of define our own identities and how other people think about ourselves, right? And so, you know, there are many Latinx people, you know, to use a term that applies in, you know, a non-gendered way and probably in that politically correct universe. It's when one says that kind of term, they're expressing kind of a commitment to acknowledge the complexities of individuals' identity, right? That there are certain Latinos that may not identify in the maleness of Latino, that they might not want to be Latina because they're not female, but they want to have some sort of other identity in that, right? So there are people like that, and if we want to embrace and have a vocabulary to speak about communities of commonality, then sometimes we have to have a different language. And so the problem I think that we all have with political correctness in the United States is that it is often combined with a kind of a lack of generosity, and that lack of generosity is a consequence of historical marginalization, right? At a certain point, you know, the people who are marginalized believe that that you know, the time has come. It's too late. Why would I be generous in just forgiving these identity labels that have been stigmatizing me for so long? I'm just going to cancel culture them, you know, or I'm going to, you know, not forgive them anymore, because that kind of forgiveness empowers them and comes at the expense of me, right? And so there's like this kind of tension that kind of comes about in this politically correct moment. And I think that the real problem here is that when we talk about political correctness, there's people who think about it as rules, right? That if you follow these rules and say these things, then that's acceptable. And then there's an ethical kind of orientation, right? These are the two interpretations of a word, right? That one is, I can't say the right things ever, because if I don't follow the right rules of what to say, then I'm always stepping on kind of this textual landmine, Oh my God, I can't live in this world where I have to live in textual landmines, right? And so the impulse is to say, let's forget about this whole political correctness. Just let me call you what I want to call you, and, you know, and be generous with me, right? Like, know what I'm talking about, right? On the other hand, there's kind of this ethical argument that people make that are defenders of political correctness by saying that, you know, if you really acknowledged me and if you really know who I was, then you would acknowledge that there is a different way that I want to be called. You know, you wouldn't call me by another name than my name. Why would you call me by another identity than what is my identity, right? So if I'm asking you to call me by a pronoun they, and you insist that I'm he, then that's not just a rule violation, which is in that other paradigm. What that is that it communicates to me that you're not ethically committed to me. You don't expect mutuality from me, right? You really don't care what I want to be called, right? And so communicating, like, and attempting to use those kind of correct terms, if you will, is really the attempt at striving to be more ethical in that paradigm. Whereas saying I'm not going to do that is taken by that paradigm to say, well, it's not a rules-based thing. If you cared about me, you'd at least be making an attempt, right? You wouldn't be having this big controversy over political correctness. You would be willing to just say, oh yeah, my bad. I made that mistake. I referred to you as they. It's just a habit of speech, right? And you kind of correct yourself and you say they, right? And, you know, and then that kind of commitment to each other is reaffirmed in those moments, you know?
You know, one of the reasons I really love doing these conversations is because we get the people who are watching, it spans from alumni to our current students, actually, and to recent alumni. And I find this like topic very interesting. And I wonder, as a professor working with your students, has this conversation come up about political correctness, and kind of give us some insight as viewers and spectators to this conversation as how that kind of goes, or what you've seen?
Yeah, it has. I mean, in general, I think that my students are pretty receptive to trying to do their best at using terms that people identify with, right? I mean, if James tells me that he does not want to be labeled as Latino, then I'm not going to introduce my former Latino student. That's not only rude, right? But it's making James felt not heard, right? And if we're going to establish a community together, then it's got to start with the idea that, you know, we're at least making an attempt to call people what they want to be called, right? And, you know, if I want my name to be, you know, Grand Supreme Commander of the Universe, and you don't call me Grand Supreme Commander of the Universe, then, you know, maybe that is, you know, your unwillingness to kind of take part in the kind of identity that I have, right? And maybe that means that we have to have a conversation of why I would want to be labeled that way. That's a good conversation, right? Because you can say, hey, I don't want to call you that because I think that that tells the world something about like how I would relate to you, and I don't think that you should have power over me, and you can have that conversation about the identity. But you know, I think that what these kinds of paradigms miss with each other is those perspectives, right? And let me just talk a little bit about that other direction, right? Like if you're coming from the ethical perspective and you're facing somebody who says political correctness, blah, 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 then, you know, they kind of get tired sometimes of just being called something by somebody else that they don't want to be called, right? Yeah. And so then that fuels their being very upset about them. And the politically correct people over here say, oh my God, like, what's your problem? You've been called this for so long, and, you know, like, you just don't really care about me making this mistake, right? And so I think at the core of it, we have to have more conversations about kind of the changes that would be necessary to account for the differential experiences that people have when it comes to that. And I think my students, they're generally very open to that, you know? I mean, we have our own habits of language. They're not easy, you know? I mean, I've had students before where they'll say, you know, my personal pronouns are they, them, and their, and I'll like be writing a letter of recommendation and I'll say she, you know, and I'll be like, you know, crap, you know, I'm sorry, I messed up your letter of recommendation and I didn't use your pronoun. But like having that conversation with the student, I think reaffirms the kind of commitment, like, hey, I'm willing to try to change this to account for the complexity of your identity because you are not he or she. And that signals my commitment to you. And then they're able to possibly say, okay, well, that seems reasonable. Now, if I continue in letter after letter after letter saying she, and then she says, or they say, right? That's even in the language, right? If they say to me, you know, you're not changing, right? And I go and say, well, screw you, because it's politically correctness, you know, I can say whatever I want. Yeah. Now, that doesn't communicate to that person that I have that expectation of mutuality, right? And so I think that that's kind of what is going on with this whole thing with political correctness. But, you know, there's also the complexities of chronopolitics. There's a time dimension where we don't have time to have these deliberations anymore. We're like, you know, we yell at each other in a Facebook post and then we like move on, right? And so like that time element, that commitment element, all of those things are necessary, and we just don't have those spaces of temporal deliberation as well. So there's a whole bunch of complicated factors.
Well, yeah, the focus changes every 5 seconds, right? To some other topic that's happening in the media, that something else is happening. But I do want to thank our viewers for asking those questions. I thought this was a really good dialogue about that specific topic. I do want to switch gears just a little bit back to just a little bit more about the Constitution, just to reflect on Constitution Day in that way. We did get a great question about you know, in these times, you know, the Constitution definitely setting an example for many democracies around the world. But what do you think is the Constitution's influence nowadays around freedom of speech around the world, especially with some of the leadership that we do have, and when folks feel like it's being infringing on their freedom of speech? And what type of role does the Constitution play as that example when we talk about the world and other things that are happening and how America stands in that way.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating, especially when it comes down to, regulating hate speech, for example. We've made our decision in our Constitution to not come down on the side of regulating hate speech. And other countries around the world have regulated hate speech. And the reason that we've come down on that side is because it's the people that will ultimately decide in any given case, to borrow from Aristotle, right? If they're persuaded that hate speech has occurred in a trial, right? And so what constitutes hate speech? And so in the United States, we've said, we don't want people in the government making that determination for us. When we go down that road, what hate is to different people would be defined as different things, right? I mean, a lot of these tools that would attempt to be used in the favor of a progressive politic, for example, come back to be a double-edged sword and harm them, in terms of their implementation. You have cases in Europe, for example, where they will, say F you to their president. It was some term that was just similar to that, fairly innocuous in terms of it's what we would consider as Americans. And in France, the person was found guilty of a hate crime, all right, a hate speech, because a particular jury said, yeah, I mean, why would somebody say that about an office and a figure that represents a particular group, which is the government, that then was defamed in terms of their character and targeted on the account of them being a president and representative of that group, which is a type of hate speech like an ethnic group or anything else, right? And so if they are as part of that group identity and that becomes the interpretation of a jury, then they can convict the people under those hate speech ordinances, right? And so if you get a white supremacist jury, for example, they might consider somebody who's advocating affirmative action to be engaging in hate speech, right? If you get a all-black jury, then they'll consider any speech that comes from any group that's predominantly white and advocates white supremacy to be hate speech, right? And so in some ways, it would just depend on the kind of juries you get. And the history of the United States has suggested that we don't want juries making those types of determinations because that's when the injustices occur with individuals, because it's a persuasive dynamic. So we've opted to keep government out of those kinds of kind of scenarios, whereas other, like European countries, for example, have regulated hate speech and seen the laws applied in ways other than they were maybe perhaps intended at the outset. So, that I think is an interesting kind of dynamic. And one of the things that, interestingly enough, I have an immigrant to the United States who's a current student, and just yesterday he was saying that one of his professors asked him what he liked about America the most, and he said that his response was interesting to me. He said, it's because we have a system of checks and balances. It's not easy to get things done here. There's no one government entity that can rule that you did this and so you're in jail, or, in terms of your constitutional rights. They can't say, you did this hate speech, I think this is hate speech, it's hateful toward you or toward me, and so therefore I'm going to put you in jail, right? And so he liked this idea of the checks and balances, that we have these rights that government can't take away from us. At least if they do, they have to answer to that, to the American public and to other branches of government, et cetera. So anyway, I thought that was interesting.
No, it is very interesting. I think kind of the follow-up to that was asked is just, do you believe that so I kind of feel like the answer is yes, if our Constitution is still having a good impact, or not a good is everyone can define what good means to you, but it's still having an important impact on other democracies.
Well, the world's huge, so I guess the answer would probably be that we're impacting some more than others.
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
yeah.
What are there? 440 countries or something like that in the world,
Sure.
depending on the given. So,
Sure.
I mean, who knows what the impact is? But I know that there's still a lot of people, especially people who are wanting to migrate to the United States, that really believe in our system of constitutional democracy. So.
And I love the way you frame it, because it kind of gives us some vision past the woods, right? And it kind of lets us see through the forest a little bit, because I think sometimes we see so much of what's going on and we see so much of the news, and we kind of lose track of how that kind of still has that impact. And again, depending on where you're looking at. I do want to go back a little bit, just because there seem to be more questions that we that came in through after our conversation.
I welcome them. That'd be great.
Yeah, so a couple things did go back a little bit, so we can talk more about kind of this, not necessarily cancel culture, but in that environment, in that vein about political correctness again, just to get a better sense of what your view and perspective are. I'm going to say for our viewers, before I ask that question, we are running up on the last 15 minutes or so, so if you did have a question, you were holding on to it, please put it in so I can try to get to it or tie it in to some other questions that we did receive. So Dr. Johnson, the question is about, and I'm not familiar with this particular law, but what about the laws that enforce political correctness, i.e. Canada with two N's, bill C-16. I don't know if you're familiar with what they're referring to. Okay, so it's just laws that enforce political correctness, I guess is what they were mostly asking about, and if you're familiar with any laws that maybe are trying to enforce it on folks to actually do that.
I'm not familiar with those yet. I think that the closest that we've come to that conversation is about hate speech. I think that if hate speech is difficult to regulate, it's probably even more difficult to get down to the roots of political correctness.
So great, especially like we were just talking about. So, and then kind of along those lines, have you heard of the Karen identity? Have you heard that on social media at all? Like, oh, you're such a Karen.
A little bit, yeah, okay. A little bit.
Yeah, so there's a question kind of about that, and that identity basically being somebody who, I mean, I wish I could even exactly say it, but I want to just kind of ask their question. So considering that Karen identity's prevalence in the social media climate, but also just the social climate with Black Lives Matter and wearing masks during COVID, and kind of how do you, what are your thoughts regarding that kind of description of assigning people an identity and kind of blanketing that, because that's a form of changing people's opinion based on the way that you're doing it. And how that's kind of working through social media, I think. Yeah,
I mean, this is not new to a lot of industry professionals, right? It's just a matter of branding. And I think that the OK Karen is a particular brand to label the kinds of behavior that have been the targets of critiques from those organizing groups for many, many years. So in that sense, it's just been, no different than a form of branding.
And but I guess I think with that, they're kind of poking at the idea about social media and how that is, I guess, governed by the First Amendment. Maybe is there anything? And
social media is really interesting because again, there's one interpretation that says that we can regulate things. On the other hand, people who there's a lot of people that I've come into contact with that will really want there to be open spaces on like Facebook, right? And on the other hand, they don't want to have public ownership or centralized control over the communication spaces, right? So they don't want the government owning Facebook, for example. But there's a tension there, right? Because if we have joint ownership over it and it is a publicly owned thing, like our school system, for example, then we have to enforce codes of free speech, right? But if it's a privately owned thing, Facebook is a private entity. They can do whatever they want in terms of censorship. They could turn themselves up into a niche market to be a totally right-wing or left-wing ideology if they want, because they're a private company. They're a private organization. It's private to private communication. And although we think about it as public, it's not publicly owned. It doesn't happen over the public airwaves. It doesn't happen over a publicly owned server. It doesn't happen over a publicly subscribed internet package. There's not much public about it. And so the First Amendment doesn't necessarily even apply in those contexts.
And so I think with that, another question came in about Google's algorithm and the search engine, that how that operates, but that would kind of fall under the same understanding.
Right.
Is
Google's
that right?
private. We don't own that as a public, right? And to regulate that private entity, we would have to face a high bar because it says that Congress shall make no law depriving those rights, right?
Mm-hmm. Definitely. I'm going to go back to a couple of questions. I do want to take a couple minutes to go back to the Constitution Center. We did get a question a little earlier just about how you found yourself as the director and kind of, what you guys are up to nowadays.
Yeah, so I began as a research fellow of the center and then left Long Beach State after I earned my master's degree and earned my Ph.D. from the University of Texas. And then I made my way back to the CSU by being hired at Cal State Chico, and then they hired me back here at Long Beach State. I assumed the role of director of research while Craig Smith was the director of the center, and I was also a professor in communication studies. And I worked nationally in the organizations on First Amendment issues. And so then when Craig Smith retired, I was selected to be the director of the center. And since then, we've grown to have a First Amendment Scholars Program that has been implemented over the last 10 years, where we have over 100 First Amendment scholars that are selected for their excellence in the First Amendment course. And they vary in a variety of professions, from lawyers to judges to musicians to screenwriters and everywhere, industry professionals, et cetera. And they're a wonderful group. We reach out and sponsor graduate student research. We give many different public talks throughout the United States, and I've been in other countries like Canada and Sweden and Italy and so forth like that, to be able to talk about freedom of expression in an international context. And so it's just been a really, really good time. A note to all the people out there is that if you want to support the instruction about this, I'm happy to accept donations. We don't receive any funding stateside from the university. So any money that I can generate as director has to be raised on my own. So if you want to channel some money to the Center for First Amendment Studies, I'm happy to use that in support of educating people about the First Amendment.
And that's perfect. And is there somewhere they can go for more information on that? I do have a couple more questions to get to, but I want to make sure I get this in because we're going to run up with these questions right to the last minute. So yeah.
Yes. So if they go to the Center for First Amendment Studies website, there should be a donate button on that particular website. It's firstamendmentstudies.org. And if you can also access it through the CSULB Foundation account. If you go to the CSULB Foundation to donate to the foundation, make sure that you select the Center for First Amendment Studies as the target of that. Otherwise, it'll just go to the general foundation and I won't see any of that money in the center.
So hopefully folks got that. And one more plug before I ask the final question that came through is that Tuesday is National Voter Registration Day. So just want to make sure that folks register before then, but even during that day, CSULB and our ASI team are going to be getting a lot of information out about registering to vote. Of course, just make sure you do it by October 19th. I think that's the deadline that we're shooting for, but do it September 22nd to get it out of the way, and then you're good to go.
This election will dictate a lot of our constitutional future because no matter what the politics are, there's likely 1 or 2 seats that are available with the Supreme Court in the next term.
Perfect. Perfect. So the question kind of is just about, to your point, that the government doesn't own the tech companies, and it can't, really difficult for them to regulate that, a very high bar, but protecting them from defamation suits, and kind of thinking about them being, they're hosting this information. What are your thoughts on that from your perspective?
Yeah, defamation is really interesting. I think that a lot of defamation suits have a better chance, from what I've heard, in the civil litigation, the civil remedies. But here's the problem, is that the defamation has to be grounded in a number of evidentiary barriers that have been flipped in presumption for burdens of proof. So if you are the target of libel, if you can prove that it's untrue, right? That if it's factually untrue, if you can prove that there's some damages, and if you can prove that there's malice, I believe that those are the 3 kinds of characteristics that are necessary for a libel suit. I'm not a lawyer, so I can't give you that legal advice, but I'm pretty sure that those are the characteristics. And if you can prove that, then for sure you can win, and you as I understand, you might have a better chance of persuading a jury in a civil case about that than going after them for a violation of a criminal statute.
Interesting. Thank you. We do have a question from one of your former students as well. So along in the club here, and he asks, just trying to outdo me over here is what he's doing. Do cases like Bethel versus Fraser, and this is from Christopher Gutierrez, Bethel versus Fraser apply to schools?
Of course, he's going to ask a complicated question. So they're going to see in real time how I handle questions from students. Okay, ask me about Bethel versus Fraser.
Do cases like Bethel versus Fraser apply to schools during distance learning? Is his question.
Oh, that's a really good question. I would say that they would when the
For our other viewers who may not know, do you mind educating us on what Bethel versus Fraser may be referring to?
So Bethel versus Fraser has to do with a student, Matthew Fraser, who was responsible for a speech of a person running for Associated Student Body President, I believe, Associated Student Office in the high school. And the speech was filled with sexual innuendos. So I forget what they were, but you can imagine the innuendos like,
Sure.
you know, this candidate will stand stiff for you and, you know, whatever. Go to the point of climax, like all these innuendos.
Yeah.
And the student was suspended, and the court ruled that that speech was not protected because it was not inside the educational bounds of a student. And more importantly, it was speech that encouraged sexual behavior. And there was a lot of money invested in preventing teenage pregnancy and everything else to take sex seriously. So making light of sex was not protected speech for K through 12 education. My guess is that those standards will still apply today through the Zoom space because it's utilized by a public school, presumably in a public space, entered into contract with a private organization, but still subject to public laws. So my guess is that the standards of Bethel versus Fraser would still apply to the virtual schoolhouse gate, especially when hosting events on behalf of the school through the private server, because it's still the public to private communication, and the public would still have the ability to be subject to that kind of regulation. So that would be my answer. I would guess that Morris versus Frederick and Bethel versus Fraser would still apply. So your students do not have a constitutional right to speech that encourages irresponsible sexual behavior and speech that could be reasonably regarded as promoting illegal drug use. There's my mouthful.
I appreciate that, Dr. Johnson. It really unpacked, because you made it simple for me to understand, and I wasn't too familiar with what was being asked, and I really appreciate that. But that speaks to this whole conversation, and I think I really look forward to hopefully bringing you to other forums and having conversations with our students in a larger forum than just your classroom, for example, and also amplifying your messages from the center, because I think the work you all do is amazing. We are running right against 3 o'clock here, so I have a couple things to quickly say. But first and foremost, thank you so much. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you for the expectation of mutuality. I look forward to engaging in that mutual exchange from here on. Hopefully, when this pandemic is over, we can get together and join us for some, wine or whatever, or some beer in the Nugget or the Shark Den or whatever we're going to call it, and we'll.
Probably, yeah, the Shark Den is not a bad name. I kind of like it. We'll pitch it to the 49er shops. So let me go ahead and close this up here. Thank you, Dr. Johnson. What I do want to say is thank you everyone for joining us today. I want to invite you to visit CSULB alumni on the website, again at csulb.edu/alumni, or on Instagram at the handle CSULB alumni to learn more about future 49er industry chats, and follow us again at that handle. And we thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, Dr. Johnson, and hope everyone has a great rest of your Constitution Day. So take care.